as we open up the floor for folks, I guess I will start with a question for each one of you. And that would be, what are maybe one or two major barriers that are preventing us from acting on utilizing the potential technologies that we can to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in these different sectors?
I can start. This is one of the my pet peeves because we have a lot of technology that we can deploy fairly quickly, but the regulatory process for feed additives is right now is very, very challenging. We have feed additives that are approved in Europe, in Brazil, Chile, and a number of other countries, but we can't use them in the US yet. And there needs to be some sort of change in the policy. Instead of treating feed additives, antimethanogenic feed additives in particular, as a veterinary drug, we need to treat them what they are, just basically reducing emissions. Obviously, we have to do all the work to make sure that they are safe, they are efficacious, and everything else. But the barrier in the US is just too high right now, and we're going to be left behind if we don't change.
I think part of it is realizing the valuation of the whole process, because we know, okay, I can put in an enzyme, but in the poultry industry and swine industry, it's just like, okay, what's the feed cost? And that's it. And we have our cost centers are segregated, and everybody's trying to achieve the lowest cost at each cost center. But over the whole thing, there are things that you can do that actually has the best profit. If you take that same concept and say, now I'm going to expand that to climate change and things like that, it requires a much different approach from decision making. And where do you place your value? Because if you can demonstrate that something I do to broiler breeders will have a significant impact on, or dairy cows or something like that, cow-calf operation, on the overall picture, and shows the value, how do you incentivize that change up front? So that's where I think models, decision-making tools, things like that could have the greatest impact of using the technology that we already have, is just applying them and being able to incentivize, much like Frank talked about, is in trying to have a carrot instead of a stick approach to justifying change.
Well, for beef, and I think it's beyond beef too. I mean, I think it's economics, cost of production. We're used to cheap food and we want to keep it cheap, and everything we can do to reduce greenhouse gases is going to cost something, and it's going to cost the producer, and who's going to pay for it?
From my perspective is education and culture, and basically the kind of incentive. For example, in aquaculture, I mean, the adoption of digital technology, software, and et cetera is lagging the other field. Things I was learning in swine production when I was an undergrad in 1980s is like, it's the kind of, we'll say, well, why do I need a software to keep track of my data and estimate something? It's like, hasn't made it its way. Although everybody has the latest cell phone and the latest cell phone in their pocket and they have technology, they don't use this to manage their farm. The other thing is the incentive. One thing in aquaculture that's relatively different from other animal production is we have certification programs. So you can't sell salmon to Walmart if you're not BAP certified, or your shrimp is not BAP certified, etc. So there are a system and these organizations to step up their game and says, well, carbon footprint is important. And once they say it's going to be important, then they're going to say, well, the producer will have to adopt new practices for sure.
All right, I'll remind our audience again, y'all are more than welcome to join in on questions. If there's anyone, please speak now. Otherwise, I'll keep going all day. So,
I'm Dale Gatlin of Texas A&M University, and I'm referring back to one of the talk this morning, and it was related to the population centers of the world, and particularly in South Asia and India. And I'm thinking about water use. All of the speakers this afternoon mentioned something about water use and how it comes into the equation, specifically with related to aquaculture and the fact that there is a tremendous amount of fish produced in those parts of the world, which are heavily populated. It makes me think that certainly they're using those resources to some good extent in terms of providing nutritious protein for local communities, but more and more those higher value fish stocks that are being produced in those areas are actually being distributed around the world, including coming into the United States. Estimates now are somewhere around 80% of the seafood consumed in the U.S. is coming in from overseas. And just in terms of the global aspect of food production, I just wondered if perhaps Dom could comment on how aquaculture is not only diverse in terms of species, but in terms of targeted markets and so forth.
I mean, in terms of water use, I mean, aquaculture is producing water, but they a lot of exchanging water. So we work with shrimp farmers, and we try to implement water saving practices, because like it says, like, yeah, you change the water, you use the water, but at the same time, you dumped all your waste in the public domain for your neighbor to pump in their own ponds or for the environment to get degraded. So actually, yes, the production practice needs to become more conscious of saving water, but also being better environmental stewards and not dumping your waste for everybody's affecting this. But definitely, there's a lot of work to be done on improving practices in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, and places like that for sure, where the bulk of the production is located for sure.
Luis, are you?
So Luis Tedesco from Texas A&M, really nice presentations. Thank you. I think it was probably the first presentation or the second, I don't remember. It was shown that the three pillars of sustainability, the economic, the social, and the environmental. We've been talking a lot about the environmental. Some of you mentioned the economics. I would like to hear the positives and the negatives of the social aspects of sustainability in each one of these areas.
Well, I don't actually work on the social aspect of sustainability, but it's increasingly an important aspect when we think about issues like equity issues and access to food issues. Even in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, I think a lot of us in the high income countries have done a lot of the emissions up to now, and a lot of the suffering is happening in low income countries. So how do you balance that? How do you make amends to try to mitigate this impact? How I think the high income countries have already done a lot of the emissions, need to help the low income countries to not to get into a situation where we are now, and the demand for animal source foods, as we talked earlier, is mostly in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And if we don't help and improve the improvement in terms of the feed efficiency and all that, we don't want to increase the number of animals to meet the demand. If you do that, then you're going to increase a lot more of emissions and all that as well. So how do we make sure that there is an equitable access to food and to resources so that the demand can be met with as minimum impact on the environment as possible?
Yeah, if you look at just the ISO standards, I mean, the social LCAs were the last to be added, and I think it's also the most complex. So if you're discussing the things about, a lot of times there's a complete opposite of what society sees as value, and if we're just looking at the numbers of global emissions. So for example, we're dealing in the poultry industry, everybody wants chickens to be grown pasture raised and things like that. But if we all went to that, we would decimate we would have such a problem with global warming because of the efficiencies, the other kinds of issues, land use. I mean, no matter how you look at it, if you just looked at the welfare part of it, it's not compatible. So that's why a comprehensive view, it's a give and take when you're going to make a policy that has to have a global impact. It needs to look at all factors, not just environmental, the eco efficiencies, et cetera, has to be incorporated into it. And I don't think our models have developed to the point to do that effectively for the animal industry. I mean, they're borrowing, those models are using all kinds of different approaches and assumptions. And so they come up with different conclusions and different metrics. So how they don't talk to each other. So I think that's the biggest opportunity, I think, for us as scientists and funding agencies, is to come up with a standard that everybody can agree on, and that you can also incorporate some of those social aspects into a decision.
I don't think I can have much to add. I mean, I agree with what's been said. I mean, the social issues is a tough issue. And from a life cycle assessment perspective, particularly, I mean, there's attempts being made. It's important, but we have a long way to go before we can really integrate that into our real whole production system assessments.
It's a big issue of perspective. I find that they've had do quite a bit of work in Southeast Asia and do work in Ontario, where in cottage country and stuff like that. And the practice that I see, well, you can't do this, and in Southeast Asia it's perfectly acceptable because they say, well, it's going to be just more food, right? It's food security issue or just more revenue for people. Whereas if you deal with a cottage area, something like this, any agricultural activity will degrade the environments, and therefore, will decrease the enjoyment of the people there. So perspective is extremely important when you try to determine that social societal impact.
Pedro Urriola, University of Minnesota. And I want to bring the topic a little bit to nitrogen. It was mentioned by several of the speakers, and I work with monogastric animals, and I see some of you also with some of the species. So what are the opportunities on nitrogen and management, and how do we create that? This morning we heard from Dr. Midloner the carrot approach to incentivize management of nitrogen. Is that very different from management of methane and carbon? Is that different for nitrogen? And do we need to develop something different, or what would we incentivize? If it's important, what would incentivize, your opinions, into anybody in the panel?
Well, I work a lot with dairy as well as beef. And from a dairy perspective, there's a lot of things you can do to reduce particularly ammonia emissions. Again, it's economics. I mean, everything costs more. So who's going to pay for it, and how much are we willing to pay to get it done? But there's certainly lots of opportunity. When it comes to beef, then it's a little different story, because unless we bring all our animals in, put them in barns, and collect all the manure, and that's not going to happen. There's very little that you can do with a grazing animal that's urinating over the field, that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's much more limited when it comes to beef.
I think some of the carrot part of it is related to just plain efficiencies, right? And the economics. So as the fermentation costs of amino acids are going down, we're looking at new technologies. It's just going to be a cheaper way to do it. And so that's going to drive matters there. We know in poultry houses, excess ammonia emissions is a problem also for the animals and the workers. All right, so there's ways to do that. And in countries like in the Netherlands, it basically scrub the air that's being exhausted to capture ammonia in some operations. So again, that comes at a cost component, but if there is a regulation that's placed on there, well, you know, for them to stay in business, they're going to have to do that. In North Carolina, we have a lot of nuisance complaints. So we've got people building houses next to a farm. They just may have just moved there, but then they slap on a legal suit. So just to deal with that, there's new technologies being developed just so that you can co-inhabit a growing population. And we keep saying, folks in just stop moving to North Carolina, please. Because it's messing up our countryside because of right to farm acts and things like that. So those are all of the issues that I think there are solutions. Again, it's multiple approaches to try to resolve some of these issues. But I think in general, there is a willingness to try to reduce ammonia emissions in general and excess nitrogen excretion.
Well, we've done some simulations on nitrogen and how low can you go in terms of providing the crude protein for ruminants, and 12, 13% is achievable. You know, from the current 17, 18 or more percent of crude protein, you can go down to that level. But to be able to go down to that level, you have to provide bypass amino acids to ruminants. So basically, you're feeding a ruminant like a non-ruminant and like a pig, basically. And so, I mean, the niche of ruminants is to really utilize feed that's not used by other species, humans and monogastric. So, there's that balancing act that we have to do. But you know, one of the biggest ways is really to try to reduce the amount of nitrogen that goes into the systems. And in swine systems, we've shown through modeling that, you know, when you replace soybeans and others through by amino acids, synthetic amino acids, then you have a huge environmental impact there.
We can add something that we didn't talk about today is we focus on the animal and the farm, but we are feeding these animals with feed ingredients and they came from somewhere. They were produced in a certain way. And I work on protein digestibility, and we do find great variation in protein digestibility, which will result in more solid nitrogen waste. So the processing of the feed ingredients has improved over the years. For example, did research on rendered animal proteins, and digestibility definitely improved 15, 20 percentage point over the past 30 or 40 years when I compare notes with my predecessor. But still there's things, and there's hardly any work on what we determine is the heat damage to protein has a very important impact on the digestibility and bioavailability. You can measure something as being digestible, but it's not bioavailable. It will disappear. And we did nitrogen mass balance for feed ingredients themselves. And there's about 9 to 10 to 15% of nitrogen that is missing. When you do your UPLC, HPLC analyses and you sum up all your amino acids, there's a gap anywhere between 5 to 15% of that nitrogen is missing. And I think it's some of these compounds that we're not measuring, that we're actually not aware of, and we need to do a better job at characterizing. Knowing our ingredients, knowing the nutrient requirements of our animals is important, and we can do a better job at tailoring the diet, basically based on what is truly present in the diet and what is required by the animal, and then making sure that the ingredients that we're using are the best ingredients, are processed in the best way, so it preserves the nutritive value of those of these ingredients.
Hi, Julia Fouts from UC Davis. Thank you to all 4 panelists. My question is actually for Ermias. For going back to greenhouse gas neutrality and net zero, who is in charge of keeping companies accountable when they say they're going to reach that by a certain time? And what do you think the implications are going to be if/when that isn't met by that time that they say?
Right now, I don't know if anybody. I don't know anybody who's keep track on that. I think usually you have a lot of criticisms coming through the media when something does not look right. But right now, you know, the voluntary part of it is pretty. I think was it Frank who said it was the Wild West. So the voluntary aspect is like basically you come up with a protocol and use that protocol, and you know, away you go. The regulatory is a little bit better. For the regulatory framework, you have to have a protocol that is actually developed through a rigorous process, and that protocol is then accepted or put in the books of those regulatory bodies. And then if you want to claim credits, then you have to use those protocols in particular. So in the regulatory market, I think it's much more credible and reliable. But in the voluntary market, anything goes right now.
Yeah. All right, this will probably be our last question for the panelists.
How do you balance the social aspect of technology where people don't necessarily understand it? So something like BST or hormone implants for feedlot cattle that haven't gone away, but may at some point, helping people understand the potential environmental benefit when there's no actual animal or human detriment, but there's a lot of media hype behind potential detriment. That's probably an unanswerable question, but just curious.
I was going to say, I mean, that's just, yeah, it's impossible to answer because there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of discussion going on. I mean, things that you think would be quite easy, it makes a lot of sense. For majority of population or for a lot of population, it doesn't make sense. You know, the one that was produced in Gulf, the eco, what's called the swine, the phosphorus utilizing fire. I mean, that seems to be a great idea, but now it's somewhere in Saskatchewan in a freezer, so it's hard.
None of our other panelists want to tackle that one. I can't blame them. I'm sure they're all in need of a cup of coffee. And I believe that that's what we have on the agenda next year for about a 15-minute, I think, coffee break. So let's thank our panelists very much for their contributions.